Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Over the weekend, Helga issued a very significant strategic memo on the potential with the withdrawal of US and NATO forces from Afghanistan for there to be a move into a new era of cooperation, a prospect for that which seems to be taken up at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting underway now. Helga, what can you tell us about what's going on at that meeting?
Well, there is obviously a very great attention by all the neighbors of Afghanistan who know that, if things go well in that country, it's good for them. But if this would become again a source of opium production and trade, terrorism, then it would affect the entire region and all the neighbors. So therefore, there is a very big interest to find a stabilizing approach. And there is a very important meeting by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Dushanbe, where Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, just reiterated the need to make sure that separatism, terrorism, and extremism are not holding ground, gaining ground in Afghanistan, and that there must be a cooperative approach to build up the country. Now, obviously, the Taliban has expressed interest in cooperating with China, and I think both the previous President Karzai and present President Ghani have at various points said that they are interested in collaboration with the new Silk Road for Afghanistan. So there are hopeful signs that that could actually, be accomplished. And I think it's also very useful and important that the two foreign ministers of China and India, Wang Yi and the External Affairs Minister Jai Jankar from India, met on the sidelines of that SCO meeting. And that is also important because, India in the past did not cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative, basically because they don't like the CPEC, the economic development corridor China has with Pakistan. But now the potential exists that that CPEC corridor be extended into Afghanistan and then beyond into the Central Asian republics. So in that sense, it would be really very good if the Indian idea of connectivity, which essentially is the same thing, to bring in infrastructure development in the entire region from, South Asia, Southwest Asia, and in that way stabilize the situation. So I think this is all very promising, but not yet insecure, uh, insecure terms.
You can find Helga's statement on schillerinstitute.com, and I'd urge people to read it to get a more in depth idea of what is possible. Now, unfortunately, while the moves are being made to try to stabilize Afghanistan, there are some who are using this as the opportunity for a so called Asian pivot, to have the US and NATO establish a beachhead or a containment policy against China in the Indo Pacific region. What's going on with that?
Well, that was the very from the very beginning, that behind the idea of pulling out of Afghanistan, where the US, NATO, Bundeswehr, and other armies were involved for 20 years, that would not just be guided by the desire to end the endless wars, but that it would be a move to, cut down the logistic extension in that region in order to change to change the entire direction for the containment of China and Russia. And this is not some suspicion, but it was now actually confirmed by the designated new Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, who said it quite openly in a confirmation meeting with with this I'm sorry, I have to take some water. In a confirmation meeting with the Senate, he said that now there has to be, that if he becomes Secretary of the Navy, that he will exclusively focus on China, on the protection of Taiwan against the mainland. He said this as if the one China policy would not exist and would not be official American policy. And he said that also that would require to shift the focus on 20 years of a land war in the Middle East. It was not just Afghanistan, it was Iraq, the deployment in Syria, in Northern Africa, and basically shift the building up of forces in respect to the Navy. So he wants to have the US Navy increased from 295 ships to 355 ships. And it's quite a bellicose attitude, but unfortunately, this testimony makes very clear that forces in the military-industrial complex have the main reason for the pulling out of Afghanistan to this shift into the Indo-Pacific and the Pacific as such. Now that is only a temporary development. I mean, this moment has to be used under all circumstances for the building up of Afghanistan, so that hopefully by using the incredibly difficult terrain of Afghanistan, where the British, the Soviets, now the US and NATO did not manage to win any war, to completely shift the policy and establish international cooperation. I mean, one problem which urgently needs to be addressed is the opium production. One of the former UN czars in the anti-drug warfare, this is Pino Arlecki, he said, that at a certain point, when he was still in charge of this position in 2000, they had reached with the Taliban an agreement to basically drop the opium production more or less completely, because the Taliban don't have a business reason or ideological reason for the opium production. They did that in the past largely for financial necessities, but they would be open to replace it with something else, like agricultural production. So that, he said, was almost accomplished in 2000. Then 9/11 happened. Then the leader of the Northern Alliance, Massoud, got assassinated 2 days before the 9/11, and then everything fell apart, and the opium production increased in the first years by 40 times, and now it's basically back. That Afghanistan produces more than 80% of the world opium. So that has to be taken care of. 10% of the Afghani population right now is addicted. So you need a real serious program, agricultural buildup, to replace the opium production and the income coming from that, but also drug rehabilitation programs. And all of that really requires a gigantic effort, where one could only hope that not only the neighbors, the countries in the SCO, but also the United States, the Europeans, that they would all cooperate to accomplish that. And you could create a different dynamic which could spill over in the larger relationship between the United States and China. And one could hopefully find a cooperative approach elsewhere and not have this escalation, because the danger is that if you don't stop this US China confrontation, I mean, there are all these people from the Rand Corporation and other such think tanks who said that the question is not if there would be a war between the United States, but only when. And recently there were people saying the latest it will occur 2026. Daniel Ellsberg, not very long ago, called for a whistleblower in the Pentagon, because he said in the Pentagon there are discussions about such a war with China over Taiwan. I mean, if you provoke the situation in the Straits of Taiwan enough, the hope would be that China moves militarily, and then the question is what happens. Conventionally, the United States could not win such a war, and then the big question is, will it come to the use of nuclear weapon? And that would be the end of civilization if it ever would unfold, because I think there are very strong arguments that once you use nuclear weapons, it will not stop until all of these weapons will be used, and that will be for sure the end of civilization. So a lot is at stake, and that is why I think the joint focus on the development of Afghanistan could be a catalyzer to improve the relationship among the major nuclear powers in the world, which I think is a question of maximum self-interest of every human being on this planet.
And we can see the reaction from the British imperial geopoliticians, with the defense minister of the United Kingdom, Ben Wallace, coming to Washington this week, having another love fest about the special relationship with Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, in which he said sticking together is what it's all about, as the Elizabeth II carrier group is moving into the Indo-Pacific. Now, at the same time, Helga, we're seeing destabilizations going on everywhere, from the Caribbean, South Africa. What's the root cause of this?
Well, I think the focus in the Caribbean, in Central and South America, is the same one, namely to keep Chinese influence out of the region. And in the case of Cuba, Venezuela, to have regime change against governments which are not in conformity with what the predominant policy of the Anglo-American lines is. Now, in the case of Cuba, it is really quite outrageous, because this country has been victimized by sanctions for many decades, and a blockade which has severely slowed down and cut down the economic development. Nevertheless, Cuba has played an exceptionally positive role in terms of helping many developing countries with medical supplies. But now, in the middle of this pandemic, they are really in a very, very difficult position. And therefore, to have all these NGOs jumping around and saying, there is now a big protest in the population against the government. The Cuban government just published a documentation showing that a lot of money is being spent by a lot of American institutions. The typical regime change apparatus, Project Democracy, National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, State Department, Democratic National Institute, International Republican Institute. If you listen or look at this list of names, these are exactly the same institutions which, for example, were behind the coup in Ukraine in 2014, or who have been involved in Hong Kong. I mean, this is an apparatus who has chosen it to be their profession to go for regime change. And I think this is really outrageous, and I think people should not fall for the propaganda which comes with that.
And many of these countries are also in the midst of an escalation of the COVID pandemic. We've seen the UN General Secretary Guterres making an appeal for more doses of vaccine being made available. But give us a picture that you have of where this thing is getting out of control.
Well, it is exactly what we have said and what many medical experts have said the whole time. When you have a pandemic, it is not enough to vaccine your own population, because if it's only in one country which is poor and has no vaccines, you will have mutations. These mutations become more aggressive. They come back. They make potentially the efficiency of these vaccines less. So, there is the worry among experts that a situation could arise where, if some poor countries are left behind, that there you could have mutations who could make inefficient the entire process of vaccination which has taken place so far. It is not under control. So that's why UN General Secretary Guterres has demanded that the world needs at least 11 billion doses of vaccine to have up to 70% of the world population vaccinated, and that then there is a hope to end the pandemic, at least in its present dangerous form. So that is on the table. In Indonesia now, while in India it has gone down a little bit, it's now exploding in Indonesia, another population-rich country, which is very ill-prepared for it. So I think that the need for a world health system, meaning a modern health system in every single country, is more urgent than ever before, because you do not solve the problem by just protecting your own population and borders and don't care about the rest. In Africa, even Spiegel magazine, which is really the incarnation of all mainstream papers, I mean, they're not ever reporting anything which is not completely in line with what the narrative is supposed to be. Even they have to admit that the situation in Africa is absolutely horrible, that all the figures about the death rate, the infection rate, are all false, because there is no counting, there is no testing. People die at home because the hospitals are overfilled, but then these deaths are not counted as COVID because they only count the people who die in intensive care in the hospital as COVID death. So the real figures are much, much, much higher, and the situation is absolutely horrendous. Now, it is against that backdrop where I think this new Bloomberg COVID resilience index is really an incredibly childish effort to to fool the world public. What they have done is they have made this resilience index profiling 53 countries, and who did the best at fighting the pandemic. And lo and behold, who comes out on number one? The United States. They have categories like lockdown, which is negative in their view, and in any case, according to this calculation, China is only on place, I think, 8. And as I said, the United States is doing the best. Naturally, what they don't mention, which is where the fallacy of composition becomes very clear, is that the United States, as of now, had 620,000 deaths, while China, to the present day, had 6,436 deaths. So that's a factor of over 100 times more deaths in the United States, and I would not count that something which the United States should be proud of. But in any case, be that as it may, I think again the idea of having a vaccine competition or accusing a country which is giving vaccines to other countries of vaccine diplomacy, this is all childish and it should stop. I think this pandemic should have taught us one thing, that we definitely need to cooperate. And if we want to prevent this and other pandemics of raging, then we must overcome the underdevelopment of every single developing country, like Haiti, like Mali, like all these countries which are in a horrendous situation. We have to help them, and we have to start thinking in terms of the one humanity in accomplishing that.
Another area where you've called attention to repeatedly that's directly related to this is the world food crisis. There's going to be a World Food Summit at the UN General Assembly. Do Do you think this could have a positive effect?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it should be obvious, that with the uh, danger to still almost 200 million people dying this year. This was again reiterated by David Beasley from the World Food Program. One would hope that this preparatory meeting, which takes place in Rome from the 26th to the 28th of this month, and that is then supposed to prepare the UN General Assembly World Food Program conference in September, that would be used to really seriously start to think how to double the world food production, not only to prevent these dying people. I mean, 200 million people could die this year as a result of malnutrition, but it's more than 800 million who are food insecure. And talking about human rights, if you are all the time on the verge of dying because you can't eat enough, you don't have clean water, I think this is the biggest violation of human rights you can imagine. There is no freedom, because if you have to scratch and scrabble every day just to stay alive for one more day, you cannot talk about freedom. So I think if you are talking about democracy, human rights, freedom, we have to talk about doubling food production, because food under these circumstances is medicine. And we will do everything with the Schiller Institute to try to inspire that such an approach be taken.
Well, now, the other area that requires our intervention is that of the economy, especially with the clear moves toward hyperinflation. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of your husband's intervention in 1971. We're seeing the problem in the Western countries, but at the same time, China just announced a fairly significant improvement. So, what can you say about that?
Yeah, it's really remarkable. China had an economic growth of 18% in the first quarter. I mean, that's very big, in part because of the collapse of the previous year, but nevertheless, in the second quarter, they have an increase of 7.9%, which is also quite significant. Now, the inflation on the other side is worrisome. In the United States, the official inflation rate in June was 5.4%. And there is this ridiculous debate, between the Federal Reserve, who says, this is a temporary hyperinflation, as if such a thing would exist. And even Larry Fink from BlackRock said, no, it's not temporary. The Fed must change its policy. But what everybody knows, or most people know, that if the Fed stops their low interest rate and goes to increase interest rate to combat inflation, the danger is a blowout of the whole system because of the massive indebtedness, and then you end up in a situation where many of these minefields go up. So the only solution, obviously, is what Lyndon LaRouche defined many years ago, the four laws: global Glass-Steagall, banking separation, a national bank in every country, a new credit system, and investment in high technology areas like thermonuclear fusion, crash programs, international cooperation, in space cooperation. And then you could solve all of these problems. But naturally, it would require that, for example, the military industrial complex would retool. They could build so many extremely important things for agriculture, transport, new cities, but that requires a mobilization of, people, veterans who speak out and say these endless wars should stop, because the damage not only to foreign countries but to our own population is horrendous. So that is obviously a big battlefield. But we want to use the 50-year anniversary of Nixon uh, destroying the Bretton Woods system by replacing fixed exchange rates with floating ones on the 15th of August 71. And then the absolute prophetic analysis of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who said that if the policy continues on this deregulation, monetarist direction, we will come to a new depression, a new danger of fascism, and the new danger of a war, a world war, or we will have a completely different, just economic system. So we want to use this occasion, to really put the focus on the economic theories of Lyndon LaRouche, because his solutions are still the most urgent if you want to solve the problems of today.
And while we're speaking of urgent strategic problems, one final one to take up based on these flawed axioms is the climate policy, particularly the newly announced European Union climate policy. What's going on with that?
Well, I mean, this is so unbelievable. The EU Commission published their so-called climate package. And I have not studied it very much careful because it just came out, but it seems to be 12 proposals, one more crazy and more unworkable than the other. Essentially, what it means is they want to apply the CO2 emission trade, not only to CO2 emissions from firms, but also apply it to transport, to flights, to traffic, to buildings. And just looking at it, it will lead to an overblown bureaucracy, incredible rules, counting between countries, between categories, and so on. It will be a complete nightmare. But the bottom line is it will make everything so much more expensive. It will make production more expensive. It will ruin energy intensive industries. It will make living in a home unpayable. I mean, this is a complete insane proposal, and one can only hope that there is an absolute rejection. You can see that already, that certain industries have come out and said this is the end. For example, I think the head of Eni, that's a large corporation in Italy, said this is killing industry. Others have said, then part of it is naturally they want to stop the sale of combustion motors from 2035 onward. So you cannot buy or sell a car, or not even produce, you can forget that altogether, normal diesel motors or motors going with gasoline, and only have e-traffic. Now that will completely also not work, because to build that kind of alternative energy sources, solar panels, wind parks, for Europe, and this is just a very rough calculation, you need an additional space of at least the size of the territory of Portugal. There are no workable solution. Where do you want to cut this out? From the cities, from agriculture, from the woods? Where do you want to take that space? There are insane proposals, to set up such wind parks and other things, solar parks in Africa, and transport it all the way to Europe. All of these things are insane. They're completely lunacy. And one can only hope that the population in time wakes up and completely rejects this, votes out of office these bureaucrats who have these crazy ideas. And a sign of the time is that there seems to be, some people waking up to the amount of money the green policy would cost, and hopefully they get defeated and smashed in the upcoming federal election in Germany. But this is dangerous. I would really urge our viewers to look at this EU so-called climate package, which can only be the brainchild of people who have no interest in people, who couldn't care less about developing the developing sector, but who want to continue the colonial system like Marcani, or this insane scheme between Norway and I think Gabon, whereby Gabon must write a treaty that they do not develop anything in their country. They don't develop their resources. They cannot. They even have to reforest agriculture, and for that they get over 10 years a ridiculous 150 million. But signing a deal that they will absolutely not develop their country. Now that is blatant. I think it is absolutely disgusting, and hopefully, the justified will of the majority of the people of the world to assert their right for development will take place instead. And I would ask all of you, don't sit on the fence. I mean, this is the danger of a new fascism. Eco-dictatorship is a mild word for what these people have in store. So that must be defeated before it really can ruin the whole world and civilization.
Well, Helga, in the face of this insanity and immorality which you've just documented, I would hope that our viewers will help your optimism go viral by sharing this, getting people to log on to the Schiller Institute and make sure that people have access to these ideas which they don't have otherwise. So, Helga, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.